Hi, everyone, and welcome back to The X, the podcast about how experience shapes everything from products to services to entire businesses. I'm your host, Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal. Today, we're going to talk about the restaurant industry, as well as food delivery, and how the pandemic has changed our behavior, what consumers think about it, and what the future holds for both of these industries. Hey, man, how are you doing today?
Doing pretty good. I think this is going to be an interesting conversation today. There is so much going on within these fields.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about it last week when we were talking about the pandemic in general and how it was kind of shifting behavior. And then we talked about it and decided we wanted to go a little bit deeper and kind of separate these out and talk about restaurants, talk about the dining experience, and then talk about the food delivery experience. So let's talk about restaurants to start because there's a lot going on in that industry right now and they're really, really struggling. So before the pandemic, what did it look like? Now, I want to let all of our listeners know like Demetrius lives with a professional chef. So he has a much deeper insight into this industry than I do. I always have ideas and questions I want to ask him, but I'm going to let him kind of guide this conversation a little bit more than me this time so that he can kind of go a little bit deeper and give us some insight about what it was looking like before the pandemic and then how things have changed since then.
My partner, she works in a two Michelin starred restaurant where she's been for, I want to say about a half a year. And before that, she spent the last 2 years working, or 3 years, I want to say now, working in Michelin starred restaurants. And it's been kind of an eye-opening experience because you have certain assumptions around restaurants that charge $300 and $400 a head. But when you start to hear about them, you start to realize that they're operating on the razor's edge, and there's so many reasons for that. And just restaurants are a very difficult business. It is a very thin margin. They're dealing with tons of fluctuating prices. They're dealing with or costs for their materials, for overhead, and they're also dealing with continuously fluctuating labor and staffing, and they continue have to go back and replace people as they turn over. So it's a very difficult business, and there are people who are an experienced chef de partie in fine dining who's making about the same as somebody with about a year's experience at a normal McDonald's or a round table pizza or anything that's in your neighborhood. They're not being paid incredibly well.
That's shocking to me because I think a lot of people's experience with fine dining, if they ever have the opportunity to go to a really nice restaurant like you're talking about, I've only been once myself. You walk into this restaurant, it's absolutely beautiful. It's in this beautiful and expensive city like San Francisco or New York, and you're treated so kindly and so warmly, and you sit down and you pay hundreds of dollars for this meal, and then everyone who serves you is just kind of giving you this consistent experience throughout the entire evening. And when you leave, you feel like, wow, what an amazing evening, what an amazing night that I just had, not realizing that the people who are serving you, they don't make very much money at all. The chefs themselves don't make very much money, and that the restaurant itself, as you're saying, is working on a very, very tight margin. So I don't understand the economics of this whole thing, of how you can walk in and have such an amazing experience and pay such an exorbitant amount of money for a dinner, and the restaurant struggles so much financially. Do you have any insight into that?
Well, there's a variety of reasons for that. A lot of times because there is an expectation for the experience in general. They're paying a premium on their rent and in order to maintain the environment in which they're serving. The other thing is they are serving up the highest quality ingredients, which costs a lot of money. They're provided in smaller amounts, so they can't buy in bulk like a McDonald's would be for fries and things like that. As you well know, when it comes to hiring new people and getting them onboarded, it's a very expensive process, and the turnover rate for restaurants for staffing is around 1 year. So every year or so, you have to start replacing all your people, and
Wow.
it's
Okay.
a very difficult way to go. And one of the things that I was hearing through the grapevine was that, especially in San Francisco, that the amount of fine people who were seeking out a fine dining experience was dwindling. And the biggest reason for that, as far as I can tell, is not as much the cost, which is what you might kind of think it right off the bat. It's what I thought right away. It's more that these people who are living in San Francisco and making this kind of money, they're so busy that they don't really want to commit to a 2 or 3 hour dining experience like what you would get from a fine dining restaurant. They
Yeah.
need to be more efficient.
Yeah, the one time that I did go, it was more than 2 hours. It was actually like 3 hours. And one of the things I thought about three-quarters of the way through is like, is this going to end soon? I was having a good time, but I was like, man, it's late. Like, I'm getting tired. Like, I
Yeah.
think it started at 7. It was 10 o'clock at night. And I think they were just bringing out the final dessert or something. And I was like, man, I'm exhausted. A great experience, but like so tired. And it is, it's like you're committing your entire evening to it. Some of the things that I did kind of to prep for this particular podcast was I asked some people what questions they had about the fine dining experience and kind of the restaurant experience. And I wrote them down and I thought I would ask them to you. And if you have the answer, that's great. If not, that's fine too.
Mhm.
Um, so one of the questions that's always asked is, do the chefs that work in the restaurant typically live in the city that they work?
It's not uncommon, but you should understand that their living situation is probably not what you would expect if you're talking about somebody who's, over 35 or 40. Some of them I've heard will live in the same city, but they'll live with like 3 or 4 other chefs in like basically like a flop house, like from the start of days. And I heard of one chef he came from France. He was a pastry chef. He lived in his car for a while. Quite a few people commute. My partner, she commutes from where we are in the South Bay up to San Francisco when she's working. Obviously, the pandemic has kind of slowed things down, but it is they're living in a lifestyle that's not really intended to be long term. It's kind of something where you're younger, you're newer, you're getting established within fine dining, and then maybe you're transitioning into something else. It's analogous to like a residency or a postdoctoral fellowship or something along those lines.
But typically, though, when you're doing a postdoctoral fellowship or residency, what follows on that is usually a very lucrative career or semi lucrative, I guess, nowadays, as some of the doctors have explained to me, career where you have healthcare and you have kind of a stable client base and you maybe work in a hospital or you have your own private practice and things kind of unfold and they usually unfold in a very positive way for the most part. Is that the same experience though that a chef would have after gaining their experience in fine dining like this?
It's similar. So a lot of people after they feel like they've completed their post academic or alternative to academic education within the fine dining experience, they might shift over into something that's a little bit more laid back and higher paying, something like catering. Or honestly, if you're working, especially at a managerial level, at a like a mid-level restaurant, even something like a an Applebee's or something, you're probably getting paid more. You probably have more regular hours. You're not working 12, 13, 14 hours a day. You might be getting some health care and some benefits and things which are not really available within for chefs within fine dining, and you're just having a little bit more of a normal life and normal wages.
So one of the other questions I had written down here was whether or not chefs continue to work at like the same, like if you're a Michelin starred chef, would you ever go to a place that's a non-Michelin star after that?
Yeah.
Or is that something where you follow that career where you have to stay in Michelin starred, restaurants in order to kind of keep up your status?
You don't have to. I think that there was a time when you did. I definitely don't think so anymore. Especially you look at, for example, Las Vegas. Some of those restaurants in Las Vegas will tout Michelin stars because they had them at one point, but no restaurant in Vegas currently has any Michelin stars because they're designed to expire every year and they get reissued. Michelin stopped rating Las Vegas restaurants, I want to say like 10 years ago. So none of those restaurants have a current star, but
Mm.
people will go back and forth to those restaurants all the time. And One of the aspects of a chef life that I've seen from a lot of different my partner's contemporaries and her coworkers are they'll tend to move from restaurant to restaurant in order to learn different techniques and different approaches and different paradigms when it comes to food. So
I
there
see.
can be an element of like a nomadic aspect to their education.
Yeah, and the lifestyle itself. I mean, I think there's a lot of people that probably wouldn't want to deal with, like you said, not having health care, not making a decent wage, bouncing from restaurant to restaurant over the course of many years. I think it probably takes a very certain personality to want to be part of that lifestyle, correct?
Yeah, I feel like it's more optimized for somebody who's younger, who's in their 20s, who's kind of getting out of school and they don't have a lot of responsibility just yet, and they have a little bit more freedom to do all these things. There are people who stick around as they get older. Some of them start to make more money if they get into the sous chef, executive chef kind of range, and then if you make it to like a chef proprietor, you have a good set of investors, and you can get started on your own restaurant, then you have a chance of making some real money. But it's like most things, the odds are kind of against you.
Yeah. So let's switch over and talk a little bit about the consumer side of this. So, are the only people that are going to fine dining restaurants people who have an exorbitant amount of money? I imagine that, for example, if you're paying $200 or $300 for dinner, you're not going to go every other day and have dinner, right? You might go if you have the money to do that. Let's say you would go every couple months, maybe,
Hmm.
right? Is that so? Is that the case? Is that what they're seeing? So, like, they have
Yeah,
the
that's
same
pretty
type
fair.
of customers that
So
are kind of like weaving in and out.
it's you might expect that it would only be the wealthy, but it's not really been the case. So they've
Okay.
seen for sure that they get some middle class blue collar people in. It tends to be with maybe less frequency than others, and it's a little bit more of that is their treat for themselves. So you imagine people who are middle class, they can afford to have some nice experiences. They go on trips, they might own a nice car, whatever their particular interest is. And some of them will choose for that interest to be fine dining. So they'll spend some of their recreational funds on fine dining. What is really interesting to me is that in these restaurants where it is $300, $400 a head, a lot of them have these regulars who are in the neighborhood who have the money who will go in and eat by themselves a $300 meal for each time. And those people are actually really helping out that restaurant by giving them consistent business. There's a perception a lot of times for some of these restaurants like French Laundry that they have this long waiting list, but for a lot of them, especially certain times of the year, like around now, like around in the middle of summer, around Fourth of July, when people are barbecuing and eating outside, especially during the week or a Tuesday or a Wednesday, they have tables to fill. So a lot of times that's when those regulars will tend to show up. Other than that, a lot of it is people on special occasions, birthdays, anniversaries, graduations. That comes up quite a bit. Or in San Francisco, if you're living in San Francisco, maybe you're working in a tech job and your parents are coming to visit from some other part of the country, and this is a great experience that you can show them.
Okay. And so, thinking a little bit about what it's looking like now compared to how it did prior to the pandemic. So, those people, for the most part, are not going into the restaurant and spending $300 and sitting there for hours on end, maybe a little bit here and there, but definitely not as it was before. Are they doing a dine out service? Are they like allowing people to come and pick up that type of food or that quality of food and take it home with them? Or does that completely erode the experience?
Uh, Traditionally, they have not been. I feel like that's one thing that the pandemic has kind of forced them to embrace. And when they started shutting down the restaurants and they had to find some other form of revenue, is one of the things that I mentioned immediately. Was like maybe they should, figure out a way to do some kind of to go order. And they weren't set up for it. They didn't have kind of logistics arranged for it. But since then, they have set it up, and you can see this from Manresa and a few other restaurants that are, Michelin starred and fine dining. They've moved to things that they might call the family meal, where here's one option, or maybe two. You have a regular traditional omnivore option and a vegetarian option, and they're very similar. And you pay one price, you come and pick it up, and I mean they're pretty great deals. They're like, for what you're getting, they're like 50, 60, $70, as opposed to, the hundreds of dollars you pay normally. And you get this food at a with a certain level of craft, even aside from the level of ingredients. Their abilities and their technical abilities to create food is just at a different level. So if it's something that you're thinking to yourself, I've been cooking every night for the past 2 weeks, I'm kind of burned out on it, want to splurge on something that I can have fun with and enjoy, and kind of reward myself for being good, then maybe it is like you're going to go out and spend $50 on this amazing meal.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think right now I read that there's a huge amount of people that have been going onto YouTube channels and just really trying to recreate certain experiences, such as creating a really, really nice meal for the family, or creating fancy desserts, or mixing cocktails that you would get at your favorite bar and things like that. And you've seen kind of an explosion in that area. And what I question is behaviorally whether or not people will continue on that path even after this pandemic kind of wraps up. So let's say next summer, we're in a much, much better place than we are right now, and people have the opportunity to go back to these restaurants or to, order and bring it back to their home. But at the same time, they've skilled up, right? Because they're on YouTube and they're practicing and they're doing new things because they're at home and they have more time. Are we going to see kind of a decline, or do you think people are going to be super excited to get out of the house and just be like, I got to go back?
Well, I
You
think
know?
I think from the consumer perspective that, on the end of this, there's going to be kind of a short boom in eating out. I think people are missing it. I think they would like to go out and do that. I think they'd like to kind of re-engage in their community and their neighborhoods, and or even outside of their neighborhoods, and just kind of get out of the house and have that experience again. Also think that, with a lot of the changes that we discussed last week, people might have more time from here and there, not having to deal with commutes maybe as much, or being able to whittle down on some of the behaviors that they're starting to realize they didn't necessarily need to do in order to maintain their lifestyle. That maybe they'll be able to take more time and go out and take some time for themselves and go out and have kind of the eating out 3 hour experience, because that is, honestly, I would kind of relate that experience to paying to go to a tonight at the theater or a concert or something like that, where if you're going to see, really established act, it's a few $100s. If you're going to go see Lady Gaga or Beyonce in concert, those tickets are $300-400 anyway. So it's along those
Yeah.
lines and what you would expect from an experience, and it lasts around the same amount of time. It's just kind of the sensory mode of it is taste instead of music.
Yeah.
So
And I think there's got to be some innovation in this space, right? Like some of the articles you had sent to me and some of the research before we did this podcast, I was reading it and they were talking about how the profit margins, like you mentioned, are really razor thin. And I think one of them said somewhere close to 5% on fine dining, and others, around 10%. And you look at that and you go, that's not a really great profit margin. It makes it a very challenging business to run. It's very hard to keep the lights on every month, especially when you have something like a pandemic where they're like, oh, by the way, no one can come to my restaurant anymore. And we don't know when
yeah.
this is going to end, you know? And so I'm thinking about the innovation. I'm thinking about how food delivery has kind of exploded in this space. And I know not everybody, and we talked about this, has the opportunity to have food delivered to their homes. But now with the costs, the barrier to entry lowering. So basically, the tech companies that are managing the back end are, they're not charging what probably would need to be charged for it to be a profitable business, because they're trying
Mm,
to basically grow the platform.
yeah.
So right now it's cheaper and cheaper, like free delivery if you spend, $65 or more, and those types of things. Is there a hybrid model where you could take some sort of fine dining experience, trim it down a little bit? Maybe your footprint in the city is smaller, but you have this whole operation where you are creating these absolutely phenomenal meals, and maybe they're even displayed in that really beautiful way in a delivery box, and then they're being delivered to people's homes, but in a more like quickly, because right, it needs to be hot, right? So very quick, but also economically, right? So
Yeah.
that it's more feasible for people who are at a certain income level, right? It's not just, the majority of people are at high income, but middle class and even below have the opportunity to taste and try out these foods. I mean, there's got to be
Yeah.
some middle ground there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that will happen is kind of on the theme that we talked about last week with what are going to be the long-lasting effects of the pandemic is to a certain extent the pandemic is accelerating change that was already kind of underway. And you'll definitely see that there's definitely going to be a contraction in the short term in the size of the industry. There's going to be fewer restaurants. A bunch of restaurants have already shut down. More of them will, and will on the other side of it will this will take a different form. It'll somebody will come along who is going to find a way to innovate within the restaurant experience in a way that helps them to become more sustainable financially, and that could be some of the low hanging fruit there is including a to go option or some mini catering or figuring out maybe a low cost night or something like that. Something that will help them to become more sustainable, break even, not put so much pressure on them. One of the things that could happen from a service design perspective is instead of relying so much on the quality of the ingredients, selling a little bit more on the craftsmanship in preparing those ingredients, even if the ingredients are a little bit more mundane, instead of having
Mm-hmm.
some of these very expensive fish or meat from different parts of the world. And this has already been starting in a lot of areas, going a little bit more local ingredients, maybe things that are less expensive, maybe things that they can buy more in bulk. There are tactics within other areas, especially like some of the Asian restaurants I'm seeing in the neighborhood, where instead of having three or four different types of fish on the menu, they might have one or two, and they can then diversify by providing different preparations of it. So instead of having three or four different types of fish, maybe you have one or two, and you can have your shrimp tikka masala and your shrimp vindaloo and other different types of preparation using the same ingredients. That simplifies their supply chain, that simplifies their logistics, that lowers their costs. And to some extent, I'm sure they're already doing this, but I imagine the pressure is going to be on for them to try to take it to the next level.
Yeah. Well, what about some of these fine dining restaurants that have food trucks and have been kind of driving out to central locations outside, which, is much safer than inside, and cooking up all the food and basically using the restaurant more as like a prep kitchen, and then everything goes onto the truck, and then you take the truck out to places like Golden Gate, the Golden Gate Bridge, or Golden Gate Park, or any of those places in San Francisco, as an example, since we live here, and basically selling to people who are out there. I feel like the food truck revolution was so big and so exciting, and then all this process got basically built into it. You have to pay for parking, I pay for this, pay for that. You know what I mean? It made it harder and harder for a lot of these food trucks to survive and be profitable. But this might be kind of a new opportunity for them to reemerge and do quite well.
Yeah, I feel like one of the things that I've learned from observing what has been happening with food trucks is if you really want to stick around as a food truck, you need a brick and mortar equivalent to it. And I've seen so many of some of my favorite food trucks in the Bay Area go out of business. And I think there were a lot of hidden costs that were involved. I think a lot of regulation popped up that made it more difficult. And every time I would see, from time to time, I would look on Twitter and see, oh, where's my favorite food truck today? I'm kind of feeling like getting some of that. And I'd see a message that said, oh, we can't make our food service tonight. We're having technical difficulties with the truck. And I looked at that and I thought to myself, they just took a major financial hit because they've already paid for the food. They might have already started preparing the food. They're losing out on a night of revenue and service. They still have to pay their staff. All of these things there are things that they still have to pay for, but
Mm-hmm.
now they can't bring in any revenue. And it's such a difficult thing to overcome. And if you are, Korea had their food trucks, but they've also now have brick and mortar locations where if you can use that location to prepare your food for your truck, and if your truck goes down, you can still gain revenue through your brick and mortar. And I think that is kind of the way it has to be in order for a food truck to have a chance, because the costs just pile up. And the amount of maintenance on that truck, it's so difficult. And I think people might have underestimated that to begin with, and now they're kind of discovering it and having to adapt. But they're going to basically have to.
Yeah. The other thing that's popping up too is these things called ghost kitchens. So these are basically like, I think the former CEO of Uber is one of his companies that he's funding. Is this thing where basically you set up these like huge, massive prep kitchens, and then you allow all these companies or these restaurants to go and use it for a certain period of time, and then they get to prep all their food, get it all ready, and then they give it to all the delivery people, or they, put it in their trucks or whatever it is, and then you don't own that space. You're just borrowing it for a period of time each day in order to get all your food prepped and ready, and
Yeah.
then you're not holding the overhead of an entire brick and mortar restaurant that needs to be, have either a mortgage or a lease payment made every single month, in addition to everything else from staffing to all that kind of stuff. So you could be a chef and you could say, oh, by the way, I want to borrow this kitchen, this percentage of the kitchen. I'll be doing it every day for 3 hours. I have 3 people that work for me and I have one food truck. And now you can kind of prep all your food and get it ready and get it out to people, as well as for delivery, right? So you see people like Eat 24 and Uber Eats and all that kind of stuff standing in line, all the delivery people standing in line waiting to pick up their orders in order to take them out to consumers.
Well, I think it's a very interesting approach, and it's going to take some. It's hard for me to predict exactly what will happen with it, but we'll see. I think that one of the challenges with using kind of that blitz scaling startup model is that it creates assumptions that might not necessarily be the case. You have this model with kind of the Grubhubs and the DoorDashes of the world where we're going to provide our service at a loss in order to build our user base, and then we'll cut costs and become profitable. But you can't guarantee that when you cut the costs that you're going to maintain the same level of revenue or even anything close to that same level of revenue. And if costs increase, then you're really in trouble. And I think that's one of the things that might happen with food delivery service, and it could be something that ultimately happens with ghost kitchens, is if you're operating at a loss in order to get started, you could end up getting in a very bad place. I look at the gig economy in general, and I look at food delivery services, and I expect one of the things that will happen when some of these new requirements, treating their drivers as employees, and also just kind of the strikes that are going on, as this means that the food delivery costs are going to have to increase in order for them to be sustainable long term. And it's something that I think that is going to make food delivery, especially at least fresh food delivery. This might not be the case for grocery delivery, but when it comes to prepared food delivery, it might become less mainstream than it is now because it will become more of a luxury experience. And I think that the what will kind of grow up in that space that's left behind is more of the pickup experience, where it's a little bit more like any restaurant that you want to go to can be like a drive-through where you order it on your app ahead of time and then you show up and just pick it up and it's already paid for. That is big improvement from the user experience relative to calling ahead and then showing up and paying for it, or even before that, showing up at the restaurant, ordering your food to go, waiting for them to cook it and then give it to you. It's kind of transforming slow food experience into the equivalent of fast food. It's just that now you're doing it with a little bit more of more foresight than you would otherwise.
Yeah, and one of the things that comes to mind is, all of this stuff isn't super new. Like they've been trying this out for a long time. They started with grocery delivery, right, and trying to make that profitable, and really struggled with it. And that was back in, I think like 1999 with Webvan.
Yeah.
And right after that, Safeway.com kind of came up and they started doing delivery. And I actually tried it out. I was in college. I mean, we weren't making any money in college, but my roommate and I were like, hey, let's put our money together. It's free delivery if we spend $50 or more. And we were each spending $25 for sure on food for the week. And it was amazing back then. I mean, they drop it off on your front porch. They had cold packs in it. Everything's prepared for you. It was really nice, just like it is now. But the economics didn't work, and so everything started to kind of fall apart. But the thing that's always kept me optimistic about it, because I think over the years before this started up again, I'd always talk about it because it really was a great experience. And the thing that keeps me optimistic is the fact that the experience itself for the consumer is awesome. Right? To be able to get up in the morning and you see this box in the front of your house and it's got cold packs in it and all your food is in there and everything is hand picked and it all looks great. And you just bring it into your home and you put it away and you don't actually have to go to the store unless you want to.
Yeah.
Same thing with food delivery to the house from your favorite restaurants, right? It's a great experience. I'm not saying that it economically works or the experience works for everybody. But the idea that you can like push a button on your phone and suddenly your favorite Mediterranean food or Thai food or Chinese food or whatever it is gets delivered within, let's say, a max of an hour and a half. I mean, that's really long. And it's sitting on your front porch and you can just grab it, go inside and sit down with your family and have this meal because that experience works better for you than getting in the car, maybe driving to the restaurant in that particular day
Yeah.
is awesome. But I look at the numbers and I kind of look at how they discount the cost of delivery really high. And I wonder, how are we going to figure this one out, right? If we were called upon, you and I, because, we work with a lot of these companies on crafting the experience for the customer, we'd be sitting down saying, hey, the experience itself is getting really, really good. We need to start talking about the economics behind all this so we don't have to pull the experience away from them 2 years from now because it didn't work out, this big grand experiment. You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
I
for
don't
sure.
really know what the answer to that is yet because the variable cost of food, delivery, all that stuff. And the only one that continues to emerge is robotics, automation, self driving cars, which is pulling the human out of the equation and saying, oh, I'm going to have this little ground vehicle drive 1 mile down the street to this house. It stops in the front, sends me a text. I go out, I grab my food, and then it drives itself back to the restaurant. And I think that's kind of where things are heading.
Yeah, I think so too. I wonder. A lot of it depends on how quickly they can get there from a both a technological and a regulatory standpoint of moving to some level of drone delivery, whether that's a ground based drone or an aerial drone. I think it's probably in the range of a 5 to 10 years off, maybe even closer to the 10 years within that 5 year range. And
That
then
doesn't seem so far off, though, right? When you
no,
say
but
5 to 10 years, I go, oh my gosh, like
yeah,
that's right around the corner.
but it's a long time to be operating at a loss for a company like Grubhub or DoorDash when they have always kind of struggled with profitability. And if they continue to go deeper in the red, one of the things we might see is that these are kind of the sacrificial lambs. These are the web vans that are kind of getting out there and kind of figuring out the landscape, and they might die off, and there could be something that grows up to replace them. And it's entirely possible that that's going to be an Amazon service or a Google service or something like that that's backed by these big dollar corporations that can wait and put out that technology. We already know that they're way ahead when it comes to delivery drones and self-driving cars and those kinds of things. It could be, 8 years from now, we could be all ordering our local food on Amazon, delivered by an Amazon drone to our backyards, and that will be when it finally reaches maturity. But right now, if you're telling me that DoorDash has to take all of their drivers and make them employees and give them benefits, I can't imagine that it's going to be anything more than like a super premium luxury option for the time being.
Totally agree. I mean, when you look at the acquisitions that have been happening lately of Grubhub and others, there's massive consolidation happening because when you consolidate, right, you can kind of like pull the teams together, pull the finances together, grab a larger market share, and then potentially sell it off to a larger company if you want to,
Yeah,
or try to make it work. But if you look more strategically, like Amazon recently bought Zook, right? I think it's ZOOK, right? And if you look at their little Zook vehicles, those vehicles they're almost looks like the Mars rover, It's like they're like ready to hit the streets and kind of
yeah,
start driving around and making deliveries or even even moving people, as well. But I think that Amazon might be looking at those vehicles as an opportunity to deliver goods, the things that they sell on through the Prime membership, right? And if that's the case, then and that's where the future is going, then I guess we can imagine that all this delivery stuff will just be some little robot that rolls up in front of your house, and
Yeah,
you
I
just go grab
expect
your
that.
stuff from them.
Yeah, I mean, and we know the people at Amazon. We know that they're seeing the same thing that we're seeing. I imagine they're thinking the same thing that we're thinking. They're very smart. They're very in touch. They spend a lot of money and a lot of time and effort trying to understand both users and the market and where things are going. I imagine that's already in their heads in the same way that's in ours. And when I hear about consolidation, when I hear about Grubhub or DoorDash snapping up their competitors at a time like this, what I mostly see is them setting the stage for raising prices. Because in order for them to do that and to be successful at it, they can't set themselves up to compete with a new startup that is running on investor money that is willing to operate at a loss in order to get users. So if they can start to clear that field a little bit, then they can raise prices and not get undercut by another company coming in and operating at a loss, at a massive loss on investor funds in order to do so.
It makes total sense. It's just such a crazy business,
It
right?
is.
Especially
Yeah.
since it's been accelerated so quickly with the pandemic. I think this was the process all along. The last couple of years, people were looking at it like this, but it was a slow incremental growth, right? I mean, like there
Yeah.
was people starting to try things out. I mean, I never used Yelp to make purchases of food to be delivered to my house before the pandemic. I just didn't, right? I would just run over and pick it up, or I would call them and they'd say, "Oh, we have delivery. You want us to deliver it?" "Oh, okay, cool." Right? It was more casual, and
Hmm.
now it was became necessary, and now people behaviorally are starting to get used to it. And so these companies now need to step up their game, and they have to really make it work. And they have to make it work both financially and from an experience perspective. I wanted to wrap up this podcast with kind of the predictions, like we always do, of what the future looks like, because this is such a crazy one. I'd love to come back in a couple of years and see if we were right. I'm going to go first on this one because I think you have way more experience in this area than I do. So I'm just want to throw mine out before you do. But my prediction is that there's going to be a hybrid of people going back to restaurants and going out and having their fun experiences like they did before. But I think there's going to be a rapid acceleration of delivery of groceries. I think that the delivery of food and stuff like that from restaurants will happen, but it just won't happen as frequently as it does right now. And then with the delivery of food of groceries, I think it's going to be massive. I think you're going to see 70% of the revenue of the sale of groceries are going to be associated with it being delivered to someone's home.
Yep.
And I think in 5 years, you're going to start seeing some of these little robots tried out and stuff. But I think it's going to happen in big cities where it's easy to map the city and kind of, move these things around. And I think you'll start to see the beginning of all this stuff. But when it comes to like restaurants and stuff, I think people will eventually go back. And there might be a new model, but I think that the traditional one will still exist.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with you, especially on the grocery delivery aspect. I think that for one, have been forced to try it, and if a chef household can kind of embrace grocery delivery, then I think anybody can because they are at a different level when it comes to shopping. Like a grocery store trip with a chef is can very quickly turn into an all day affair. It almost certainly is going to involve multiple stops. It's a journey that you go on, and if they can accept that they can get high quality ingredients when they're not hand picking them, then I think that anybody can do it. And from a logistical standpoint, it's a different animal relative to hot food delivery. You can work within windows. You don't have to worry as much about mistakes in the delivering to the wrong household, those kinds of things. So I think that is, and most of them are run out of fairly substantial corporations that can handle having a few delivery drivers at each storefront in order to provide to service the local area. They have kind of like built-in fulfillment centers, basically. So I think that will definitely be part of the future. I think that on the other side of things, I think restaurants will definitely come back. I think that we're going to see an evolution of what the dining experience will be. I think
Uh
there
huh.
within fine dining there will probably be an option or certain days in which there will be kind of a streamlined experience in which they'll looking at dinner within an hour as opposed to 2 or 3 hours. I think that within the non-fine dining restaurants, there's going to be a lot more app supported experiences there where you can, for example, order ahead of time, and instead of the current model where you show up, you put your name down, you wait in the lobby for 10-20 minutes, then you can get a seat, then you can look at the menu. It'll be more like you put your name in on the wait list from an app when you're still at home. You might look at the menu and order your food while you're still at home. When you might get a notification if the app can look at your location versus the restaurant's location and point out that, all right, you're a 10-minute drive away. I'm going to send you a notification to head to the restaurant when you're 10 minutes away from your table being ready. And you show up and you eat, you spend less time within the restaurant, but you maybe have more time, actual eating time available. And then you go on with your day, and that helps you because you're as a consumer, because you're spending less time just staring at your phone in a waiting room. And it helps the restaurant because they are turning tables over faster, so they can get more throughput, and that means more revenue for them. I think that those kinds of evolutions are going to be fairly standard in the near future.
All right. Well, we'll see how that stuff unfolds, and hopefully in a couple of years we can go back and pull a clip out and see if we were right. All right. So I think that's a wrap for today. You want to tell us what we're talking about next week, D?
Next week, we're going to be talking about news media. So, where are we now? How did we get here? Is this how things are going to be with approaches to media, or is there going to be a new future on the horizon?
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.